anemone production here in the state. She graduated in December, and I've been lucky that she stuck around in the lab for a few months to help continue working on cut flowers a bit. So with that, Shannon, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Melanie. Yeah, so like Melanie mentioned, I've been working on ranunculus and anemone for the past 2 years. So I'm super excited to share the results of our trial with you. I'm hoping that if you're new to growing anemone and ranunculus, this should be extremely helpful. So if you're not familiar with them, anemone are these flowers in the picture on the top, and ranunculus are on the bottom. Here are their scientific names. So they're Anemone coronaria and Ranunculus asiaticus. We usually grow them from their tubers or their tuberous roots. You'll often hear them called corms a lot. That's technically not correct, but I'll probably call them tubers throughout the presentation. And they're typically grown as annuals. You know, in the wild, in their native habitat, they're perennials, but there's not great year-to-year tuber survival. So we typically replace those tubers every year. In their cool season, they have really similar temperature requirements. So previous research has shown that their minimum air temperature for survival is about 27 degrees, so a little under freezing. And then their optimum temperatures for flowering are between 40 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit. So we want to try to get them growing in that temperature range as much as possible, because once it gets too hot, so if it reaches 77 degrees, oh, sorry, that's a typo, 77 degrees Fahrenheit, or into the 80s Fahrenheit, they actually go dormant. So they'll stop producing flowers, the leaves will turn yellow, and they'll die back, which is obviously not what we want if we're growing them as cut flowers. So they can be a bit challenging to grow in Utah because most management recommendations come from milder climates. And in Utah, we have this very narrow production window. So through last frost, which here in Cache County is in mid-May generally, they risk cold injury. But then by June, we're getting those temperatures that are into the 80s, and that can induce dormancy. So really the best window for them to bloom here in Utah is between late March and the middle of May. And so that's not too long to grow them. Additionally, in Utah, we have intense sun and wind that can limit stem lengths for all cut flowers, and that's especially a problem for anemones. So with that in mind, we conducted a 3-year trial at the Greenville Research Farm, which is in Logan. It's a zone 5, and we have an average last frost date of May 15th. So our goal was to determine optimal practices to advance harvest and maximize yield. And we tried this in the high tunnel and field. We wanted to help growers who have high tunnels and those who don't. And then we also wanted to work with growers across the Wasatch Front to evaluate different microclimates. And so we worked with 24 growers across 3 years that are spread throughout the Wasatch Front. We gave them planting material, we gave them soil temperature sensors, and kind of left them to their own devices just to see what would happen in other microclimates. So to go into those treatments in a little more detail, this picture in the top middle is our high tunnel design that we used here in Logan. And in that picture on the right, you see that we were trying low tunnels within the high tunnel. So in a zone 5, we're technically not supposed to be able to plant in the fall. We're supposed to wait until the spring because they risk that cold injury over the winter. And so within the high tunnel, we tried using low tunnels or covering or leaving half of the plots bare to see if we needed that extra protection, especially when we planted in the fall and in the winter. So we tried November, January, February, and March planting dates. And then in the field, we did a similar thing. So we tried fall and spring planting dates of November, March, and April. And then we tried 4 different combinations of winter protection to keep them warm. So we either planted the tubers in the ground in the fall and didn't cover with anything. We only left what they would get snow as their natural cover. We covered them with a layer of straw mulch. We covered them with those same low tunnels that we used in the high tunnels, or we did low tunnels and mulch. And then we also, in both the high tunnel and field, trialed different cultivars. So in that first year, we just tried ranunculus. I actually wasn't here yet, but 4 cultivars were tested just to see if we could do this. And the answer was yes. So in the second and third year, we expanded the study. So we ended up with 2 ranunculus cultivars and 2 anemone cultivars. And then we also tried pre-sprouting. If you're not familiar with pre-sprouting, normally when you get tubers from the supplier, they're all dry and shriveled up. they're really dry. So to rehydrate them and to get them ready to start growing, typically we recommend soaking them in warm water for 3 to 4 hours. And then we also soak them in fungicide for the last little bit because they're super susceptible to rot, especially anemone. If you soak them for too long, or if you plant them into a really moist medium, they can rot and get all mushy like you see in that picture on the bottom right. So if we're just planting them, normally we'll soak, plant them right away. If we want to pre-sprout, which I kind of like to think of sort of similar to transplanting, we'll do the soak also, but then instead of putting them right in the ground, we put them in flats of moist potting soil. And a lot of pre-sprouting recommendations vary, but we would do kind of a 2-week method. So we'd leave them in the greenhouse for 1 week in a warm environment to encourage root growth. And then we'd move them to a garage, so a slightly cooler environment for 1 more week to get them kind of acclimated to those cooler temperatures before we plant them out. And the goal of this is just to get some root growth, like you see in these bottom right pictures, get them started a little sooner so that maybe they come on and flower sooner than if we just directly planted them. So with our high tunnel and field, we use 4-foot wide beds. We use a 6-inch plant spacing. For Anemone and Ranunculus, I've seen anywhere between 3 and 9-inch spacing. 6 inches is a good middle ground if you have the space. Planted at 2-inch depth, and it's important that you plant with the pointy ends of those tubers down, like you see in those pictures on the bottom right. And then after we would plant, we would install low tunnels, mulch, and drip tape, like you see in that picture on the left. And then also something we do, they're moderate feeders. They have pretty average cut flower nutrient requirements, but we would split our application of fertilizer between half in the fall and half in the spring, so when buds are visible. That way, the plants are getting those nutrients right when they need them to really pop off in the spring. As far as data we collected, we monitored air and soil temperature to see what the plants were experiencing, as well as plant emergence, harvest timing, and yield. I'd just like to thank Paisley Flower Farm, Florage, and the Utah Premier Collective for helping us determine these stem grades. So they kind of gave us some feedback on what they'd seen with florists, and we kind of came up with these 3 grades. So we consider quality stems to be longer than 10 inches. They're likely to sell. Speculation stems are a little shorter, but still straight and have nice blooms. Maybe florists won't place advance order for these, but maybe if they have day-to-day needs or it's earlier in the season, these shorter flowers might sell a little bit. And then cull stems were too short or had deformities, so we couldn't sell them. So we gave our stems all a grade and then calculated yield by grade. And then we sold our stems to evaluate market demand and pricing. And we also estimated supply and labor costs to be able to come up with a budget. So moving on to our results, I do have a lot of graphs. I've been in grad school for the past 2 years. We like a lot of graphs, but I will try not to overwhelm you. I know I'm the first session of the day, so thanks for bearing with me through all my data. So starting with soil temperature, when we plant them, the tubers they're being impacted by soil temperature until they emerge and come out of the ground, and then they start being impacted by air temperature. So these graphs on the right are of soil temperature at our planting depth, so 2 inches, and it's the first year on the top and the second year on the bottom. And so that blue line is for the field with no cover whatsoever, so that's just kind of our natural soil temperature. Then the red line is under the high tunnel, and the green line is under a high tunnel with a low tunnel. So these are averaged over the day. So you don't really see these hourly fluctuations that we would normally see, but we have an average lift of 9 degrees in the high tunnel, and then low tunnels provide an extra lift of about 2 degrees. So basically, we're able to take an environment that would traditionally be frozen for most of the winter and make it a non-frozen environment by putting a high tunnel or low tunnels on it, which is super exciting. And then additionally, I'd like to point out that in the first year, it was a lot colder earlier on, but in the second year, it got a lot colder later. And so in that second year, it was warmer at first. The plants had more time to establish themselves and grow a little before it got too cold, but that actually made them more susceptible to cold injury later. So when we look at how this impacts winter survival, here we have graphs of emergence. So the green bars are for the first year and the blue bars are for the second year. And basically it's just the percentage of how many we planted, how many came out of the ground and survived. So in an ideal world, everything would be at 100%. Generally, we saw really good results with emergence for everything that was insulated or planted in the spring. The issue we saw, which is what we expected, in a zone 5, we're not supposed to plant them in the fall with no cover. And we found that to be true. So if we planted in November and we didn't cover with anything, about half of them died. So planting with cover is super important if you're going to plant in the fall. And I didn't include the graph for the high tunnel. We had great emergence in the high tunnel. Even if we planted in the fall and didn't cover with anything extra, we still usually had at least 80 or 90% emergence. Interestingly, pre-sprouting increased emergence and survival for anemone, but for ranunculus, it really decreased it. So if we planted ranunculus in November and we didn't cover with anything and we pre-sprouted, only about 25% of those tubers survived. So we think that pre-sprouting made ranunculus more susceptible to cold injury. So that's something to be aware of. We can look at similar graphs for air temperature over the season. So again, that blue line is for the field, and then we add those levels of insulation. And we saw really similar lifts with soil temperature. So overall, air temperature was 8 degrees greater in the high tunnel than the field, and low tunnels increased air temperature by an additional 4 degrees. Again, if we looked at this on like a 24-hour basis, in the middle of the day, we'd have much higher lifts. So at like noon or 2 p.m., we might have a 20 or 30 degree lift in the high tunnel compared to the field. But at night, those temperatures are going to kind of go back down to a very close to the field temperature. So we just need to be really mindful with our high tunnel management that we're venting during the day, so it's not getting too hot for them, and that we're watching those nighttime lows. And in the high tunnel, it got a lot colder in that second year, and we'll see that when we look at our yield. So these are graphs of our cumulative marketable yield. So these are stems per plant over the season. So from our first harvest for anemone, which happened on March 10th in that first year, all the way to when we stopped harvesting. And we really tried to keep harvesting until the bitter end just to see how long they could go. By the time we get to the end of June, they really don't look very good. And so what we noticed, like I said, is that in that first year, yields were greater than in the second year, got a lot colder in the high tunnel in that second year. And each colored line on these graphs is for a planting date. So our blue lines are for November plantings, our yellow lines are for February plantings, and red are for March plantings. And if those lines are dashed, they were covered with an extra low tunnel within the high tunnel. And if they're solid lines, they were just left bare. So we see that low tunnels greatly improved yield. They added about 1 stem per plant, whereas if we left them bare, yields were a little lower. What we also see is that our earlier plantings did better. So November and February had better yields, whereas March didn't start blooming until the beginning of May. And then by June, it's already getting kind of hot. So those March plantings only got up to about 2 stems per plant, whereas with November or February plantings, we were able to get up to about 6 stems per plant. And it's not shown on the graph, but pre-sprouting and the cultivar Galilee did a little better. For ranunculus, we have similar graphs. I didn't split out low tunnel or no low tunnel within the high tunnel because we didn't see huge differences in yield between low tunnel or not for ranunculus. What we do see is this really clear pattern of planting date again. So the earlier we planted ranunculus, the higher they yielded. So November plantings come on as early as the beginning of April, whereas those March plantings aren't coming on until late May, and they really just do not have time to bloom before it gets too hot. Pre-sprouting also improved ranunculus yield, and the cultivar labelle outperformed the cultivar amandine. In the field, we have similar graphs. I know there's a lot of lines on this graph, but bear with me. Again, the color of the line is for the planting date. So blue lines are for November, orange lines are for March, and green lines are for April. And then the solid lines were not covered with any kind of insulation, and the dashed lines were covered with the different types of insulation. So you don't need to worry about all the different dashes. What I want you to notice is this difference here. So the blue line and the orange line that are solid lines, those were our uninsulated plantings. So those only got up to about 2 stems per plant, whereas those insulated plantings, so any of those blue or orange dashed lines, got up to 4 stems per plant. So by covering with any type of insulation, whether that was mulch or a low tunnel, we were able to roughly double yield in the field that first year. So anemones are very susceptible to those cold temperatures in the field, and we can improve that with insulation. We also see that the first year our anemones did much better than our second year. Like I said, those cold temperatures that we got later in the second year, probably when the anemones were already starting to get going, really damaged those plants. So we really need to watch those temperatures. And our April plantings were generally our worst plantings. Like I said, they just came on too late. They started in mid-June. At that point, it's already too hot. They really just don't have the time to bloom. And again, in the field with anemone, pre-sprouting, improved yield, and the cultivar Galilee did better than Carmel. For ranunculus, we have the same graphs. What you'll notice on these graphs that's different is on the previous graphs, the yield went up to 5 stems per plant on that axis. Here we only get up to 2. And the yield potential for ranunculus is really closer to 10 stems per plant. So what we're seeing is that we're really just not hitting the potential in the field. And we think that's really a temperature issue. So even if we plant in November and cover with things, they don't start blooming until mid-May. At that point, even that November planting only has about a month to bloom before it's too hot. And again, we see that pre-sprouting improved yield for March and April plantings, but it decreased yield for November plantings. And then labelle was slightly better than amandine in the field, but not by much. So we can also look at this data through the lens of stem quality, so stem length. These graphs are of total yield, but split up into three categories. So our always marketable, our longest stems, our sometimes marketable, so our medium stems, and then our cull stems that are too short and we can't sell. So in an ideal world, these bars would be fully green. We want to be able to market all the flowers we can sell. But unfortunately, with anemone, we had some pretty major stem length issues. So only about 50% of the stems we grew were marketable. The way we could improve this is by planting sooner and using low tunnels. So those both helped improve stem quality. And then we use 30% shade cloth throughout the summer on these flowers. I think we could try to go higher. Potentially that might improve quality as well. There's also been some research on using plant growth hormones to try to improve stem length. That's still in early stages, but just some creative ideas to think about when we're thinking about how to get longer anemone stems, because it's a challenge for everyone, I think. For ranunculus, thankfully, we don't have those huge stem length issues. So we see that more of these bars are green. We have about 83% marketability across the high tunnel and field, which is pretty good. Again, if we plant in November and we cover with low tunnels, we get more stems that are longer than 10 inches than the other planting dates or not covering with low tunnels. When we look at profitability, we calculated enterprise budgets, assuming a wholesale market, because it's a little simpler for calculation purposes. So we assumed that we would sell wholesale through a co-op that charges a 30% delivery fee. So that's a good portion of the cost. We also assumed that 100% of stems longer than 10 inches would sell at $1.50 per stem. We don't realistically expect 100% to sell, but by putting 100% in the budget, if you know you only sell 85% or something like that, it makes it easier to adjust the math. So that's why we did that. And then for anemones, we assume that 50% of those 8 to 10 inch stems will sell, and those sell at a reduced price of $1.25 per stem. For ranunculus, we don't assume that any of those shorter stems sell, just because the quality standards are a little higher for ranunculus. And so we use those assumptions, we calculate labor costs and supply costs, and we end up getting a net projected return number. So there's more detail on these in the enterprise budgets we've published, but in short, anemone and ranunculus have really high profit potential in the high tunnel. With ranunculus, we got an estimate of $5 per square foot, which is the highest we've ever gotten for any cut flower, even higher than peonies. So that's really exciting. These have a lot of promise when grown in the high tunnel. Unfortunately, for people without a high tunnel, they were a lot less profitable for us in the field. Even in a best case scenario with the best yields we were able to get for ranunculus, we weren't able to break even. For anemone, it was a little tighter margin, and it was very dependent on labor. Because those margins were so tight, if you end up spending more money on labor, you might go into the red on anemone. But on the other hand, if you're really efficient, you could make more money on anemone in the field. And then just to tie in our grower collaborators across the Wasatch Front, how did all of them do? So that map in the top right corner just shows the different towns across the Wasatch Front where they're located. So we had a pretty good range of growers. They also noted poor emergence of fall plantings if they didn't cover with any type of insulation. Those that did cover with any type of insulation generally improved their yield, and only about a quarter of our growers pre-sprouted. We found pre-sprouting to be very helpful, so we think this is something more people could adopt. And one thing I really want to point out is this big range of yields in this table. So for anemone, we had one high tunnel grower, and they were able to get 20 stems per plant that were marketable, which is amazing. That's really like up at the theoretical maximum of what we can get out of these plants. But then a lot of growers, including ourselves, if we didn't pick the right combination of management practices, we would only get about 1 stem per plant. And same with ranunculus, we'd get yields ranging from 1 to 10, depending on how we manage them. And so just the key lesson with these crops is temperature management. If we get them going earlier, we can get these better yields as long as we minimize that cold injury. So in summary, industry recommendations for milder climates aren't always applicable to Utah because we have this narrow production window. So anything we can do to advance bloom that will help us get those flowers going in the early spring will help us improve yield, quality, and profitability. So for the high tunnel specifically, we found pre-sprouting to be very helpful, got the plants going 1 to 2 weeks sooner, got yields a little higher. We found cultivars Galilee and LaBelle to be ideal for us, although we didn't test that many, so see what works for you. We recommend planting as early as possible. In Cache Valley, we would say not to plant any later than mid-February at the absolute latest. And so if you're further south along the Wasatch Front, maybe even sooner than that might want to be your cutoff date. And then covering with low tunnels helped us improve stem length and reduce that risk of cold injury. And then in the field, planting anemone as early as possible and covering with any type of insulation. Doesn't really matter what kind it is, just use whatever is available to you. And pre-sprouting will help you improve yield. For ranunculus, you can either plant in the fall, cover with insulation, but don't pre-sprout, or you can wait until the spring, pre-sprout to get them going a little sooner and cover with low tunnels just as needed. Like in a really cold year like this, might need some extra protection in the spring. With that, I'd just like to thank UDAF, the ASCFG, and USDA NEFA for funding our research, as well as all of the grower collaborators who helped us with this study. They provided us with some amazing data, and we really appreciate their help and all their input. And then with that, all of our fact sheets and data, our publications on this information can be found at smallfarmslab.com, and we'll have 2 production guides. Those are our last publications on this that should be coming out within the next month or 2. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, well, thank you, Shannon, for sharing our research. You have a number of awesome questions in the chats, or excuse me, in the Q&A. So I will go ahead and read those. Those who are listening, please fill out the poll that we just launched. So the first question is, I had several anemone not sprout this year. Never happened to me before. They aren't rotted, just not sprouting. Is this a problem with the tubers?
That's a really good question. We also just had some inconsistent sprouting that was kind of common throughout our trial. And I think that might be something with the tubers. I don't know exactly what it is, but that was one thing we found pre-sprouting actually helped with, just by, if we got them started in the greenhouse, we could see what actually started. So that way we didn't waste time planting things in the field that were never going to sprout. So I would recommend pre-sprouting to combat that. I wish I had a better answer as to why that happens.
The next question is, how do you insulate these flowers? So maybe you could talk a little bit, and there's another one about, did the low tunnels impede the stem length at all? So maybe you could talk a little bit more about our insulation techniques.
Yeah, sorry I didn't go into that enough. But so we, in the high tunnel, we tried insulating them with AG50 fabric low tunnels. And then in the field, we tried AG50 fabric low tunnels. We tried straw mulch. So it was a layer that was about like 6 inches deep that we would put on at planting and remove in like early March, mid-March. And then we also tried fabric low tunnel with straw mulch underneath. We found that they all provided pretty similar like overall lifts in temperature. Generally the high tunnels, under the high tunnel, under the low tunnel, it'll get a lot warmer during the day, but then at night it drops to a similar temperature as outside, whereas the mulch kind of provided a more consistent lift. It would generally just keep the soil above freezing. So those are all options. People also use plastic low tunnels as well. And then going into, does the low tunnel impede stem length at all? We actually found that low tunnels helped improve stem length. So we used relatively high low tunnels. They were like maybe 4 feet tall. I know some people use shorter low tunnels than that, but there is plenty of space for the plants to grow within there. And those low tunnels actually block a little bit of light, which helps improve stem length because the plants want to keep growing to the light because there's less light. So yeah, we found that low tunnels improve stem length. But if you were using very, very short low tunnels, that might be a concern.
Okay, so we've got a few more. This next one's quick. When were you first able to water in the high tunnels in the spring? Did that impact the fall planted tubers?
Yeah, that's a good question about water. So we had access to a culinary water source to water our high tunnels over the winter. And so we would water when we planted in November. And then we really just watered once every like 3 weeks lightly from November to February. And then probably I'd say starting in March is when we really picked up our watering and started watering maybe every 2 weeks. Definitely if you water them too much in the high tunnel in the winter, that can make them more susceptible to cold injury. So just being really careful to keep them relatively dry over the winter.
You recommended pre-sprouting in a warm environment and then moving to a garage. What temperature would you recommend the warm environment be and then the temp in the garage? If you can answer this quickly, we'll try to get one more question in then.
Yeah, that's a good question. And maybe I can put more specific details on this in the chat after, but generally roughly in the 70s for that warm environment and then 40s for the garage.
Excellent. Let's see here. Do you conclude the anemone and ranunculus really need to be planted in a higher growing zone, 6B or 7?
I think it's probably easier to do them in a higher growing zone earlier in the spring, but I think we can absolutely do them in a zone 5. We just have to be careful about managing that temperature.
Okay, we might be able to fit one more. In a home garden for ranunculus, pre-sprout, plant in March, and cover until past frost date, ?
Yeah, I think that sounds like a great option. Yeah.
Okay,
Well
cool.